Welcome to the Eagle Claw YouTube channel. After the pressure of the Ukrainian armed forces and the heavy defeats of the Russian army, Vladimir Putin put all his cards on the table. One of the biggest trump cards of Putin was mobilization, and the other was annexation of 4 regions in Ukraine. But both moves show a huge failure. In the areas annexed by Putin, there is a very serious Ukrainian attack superiority. The Ukrainian armed forces have made significant progress in these areas and liberated many settlements. In total, 1,534 regions were liberated as of February 24th. Of the areas liberated by the Ukrainian army, 483 were liberated in the Kharkiv offensive last month, and more than 36 were liberated in the Donbas and Kherson offensive within a month. As of October 1st, the Ukrainian army liberated 13 regions. The Ukrainian armed forces passing like rain over the Russian army destroyed those who resisted. Nearly 15,000 Russian soldiers were destroyed in a 1-month period. However, most soldiers in the Russian army began to surrender to Ukraine. According to official reports, nearly 800 Russian soldiers surrendered in the last month and during the Ukrainian offensives. 1 general, 5 ranking commanders, and more than 100 Russian soldiers were taken prisoner from the Russian army. Now, thanks to Kiev's new campaign and appeal to Russian soldiers and minorities, Vladimir Putin's Ukraine campaign and mobilization are collapsing. Kiev took serious steps in this regard and started initiatives for soldiers who did not want to fight in the Russian army. Taking advantage of the turmoil, the Ukrainian army set up a surrender hotline called I Want to Live. The commanders of Kiev began to convince the Russian soldiers that their lives were not worth sacrificing for the whims and obsessions of their leader. This persuasion yielded great results. In the last update, more than 2,000 Russian soldiers surrendered to Ukraine, and this number is thought to increase day by day. It was announced that the first recruits who reached Ukraine after the mobilization surrendered to Ukraine. With the latest proposal made by the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, to the Russian soldiers, the surrenders in the Russian army increased. The morale of the Russian military is on the verge of collapse after thousands called the Ukrainian surrender hotline. And now it seems that his messages reached Putin's demoralized troops loud and clear. The initiative's spokesperson, Vitaly Matvienko, said the hotline was flooded with calls. In his statements, Matvienko said, "We have already received more than 2,000 applications. They are looking for both soldiers of the Russian army and relatives who want their sons and husbands to live." Matvienko assured the Russian soldiers who surrendered to them that they would be treated according to the Geneva Conventions. The commanders of Kiev convinced the Russian soldiers that their lives are not worth sacrificing for the whims and obsessions of their leader, because Putin's whims and obsessions cost the lives of the soldiers of the Russian army. At this point, the reinforcement of the army, which was in serious military crisis, with thousands of new Russian soldiers, will only increase the number of these surrenders, because the soldiers of the Russian army, who have been trying to fight in the region for 8 months, actually accept the superiority of the Ukrainian armed forces, although they are experienced. As you may recall, it was revealed in the interviews that the Russian novice soldiers who used them in the siege of Kiev fled from the front and how much fear they experienced. These soldiers disrupted the army and formed the basis of the dissolution of the Russian offensive. Vladimir Putin appears to be facing a disastrous collapse in military morale after a Ukrainian surrender hotline was flooded with thousands of calls from worried Russian troops. The Russian leader announced a partial mobilization towards the end of September as he sought to increase the number of frontline troops in Ukraine. Russian generals have long complained that they do not have enough manpower to achieve their military goals. The mobilization spread panic and fear among those eligible for conscription. More than 100,000 Russians are believed to have fled abroad, desperately to avoid being sent to their deaths in Ukraine. This means that Putin lost more than 100,000 soldiers in an instant. Ukraine Defense Ministry spokesman Andriy Yusov noted that Russians who have not yet been drafted into the military have also been in contact. The hotline has received many calls from recently called Russians and even from those who have not even yet been called, Yusov said. Desperate Russian soldiers call and ask, "What should I do if I am called? What should I do? What is the right way to surrender?" He added that the Russians lack motivation and suffer from low morale. The prospect of thousands of his troops waving a white flag has openly alarmed the Kremlin. Just days after declaring his mobilization, Putin had to impose tougher punishments on deserters. However, these penalties put Putin in a much worse place in the eyes of the Russian people. Under a new law, those who surrender voluntarily can be sentenced up to 10 years in prison. In addition, the legislation allows for the same length of imprisonment for reservists or soldiers who refuse to fight. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky also made statements on this issue, saying that an increasing number of Russians are fleeing their country and their armies. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky said that newly enlisted Russians to fight in Ukraine are increasingly choosing to flee rather than engage in a war that they see as unwinnable. In a speech broadcast on national television on Monday, Zelensky highlighted the reported problems with the Ukrainian military's recent achievements, as well as efforts to strengthen Russia's invasion with fresh troops. The Ukrainian leader's speech came after Kiev's efforts to encourage enlisted Russian soldiers to resist the war after Russian President Vladimir Putin announced partial mobilization last month. Fierce fighting continues in many parts of the front, but the perspective of these hostilities is clear. As more and more invaders are trying to escape, the enemy army is suffering more and more casualties, and there is a growing understanding that Russia made a mistake by starting a war against Ukraine, Zelensky said. Ukrainian forces have recaptured 2,316 square miles of occupied territory since the beginning of last month. Reported gains come from Ukraine, a counterattack launched over the summer in the country's northeast and south. Putin responded by announcing that he had summoned 300,000 reservists on September 21st. The order was met with protests. The Russians fled the country, and new troops were reportedly sent to the front with almost no training. As the new units were sent to the front with almost no training, thousands of soldiers in these units took refuge in Ukraine. In his speech, Zelensky referred to the news that the Russians were sent unprepared for war and said that the Russians were sent to the place of the dead. When these new ones die, more people will be sent. This is how Russia fights. This is how Putin loses. At this point, Russian President Vladimir Putin should realize that the corrupt order he has established is beginning to collapse. Vladimir Putin has been very involved in the military order since the beginning of the war. He dismissed many of his senior officers and generals. These moves completely demolished the command and command system in the army. Most of the soldiers in the army fought among themselves and began to show no respect for the officers in the Russian army. When the counterattack of the Ukrainian armed forces was successful, the soldiers of the Russian army did not listen to their commanders and decided to flee from the front. Sending recruits to such a degraded structure will not improve the situation, or even it will worsen it. For this reason, Putin's mobilization move will only increase the criticism of his administration in Russia. Currently, Vladimir Putin's mobilization campaign has recruited almost 2,000 recruits. And there is one thing in common with all war analysts and military authorities around the world. 80% of those newly mobilized by Putin will either die or surrender to Ukraine within 6 months. This is an apparent reality, and Russian soldiers are aware of this, so they pay a lot of attention to Ukraine's I Want to Live campaign. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications to support us. Stay cool. Thanks for watching.